And on that visit, I found out that my sister, my older sister, she's 1 year older than me, her name is Vanessa. I found out that she was battling addiction. And it was heartbreaking because this was my best friend. And I wasn't there to help her, support her, protect her, all the things that, we think we're responsible for. And it was heartbreaking, And so I ended up writing about, what that felt like to know that my sister was now in this world of addiction and knowing that I had come out of drug culture.
Shaka Senghor, it's an honor, it's a pleasure to have you on at the end of the tunnel. Thank you so much for making the time.
I'm super excited to be here and truly honored and looking forward to this conversation.
All right, so I want to, for people who don't know your story, we're not going to go into the detail because you've done 1,000 interviews. You've been interviewed by Oprah, like everybody. So can you just give us a montage of how you went from 14 years old, running away, to being in that cell block and writing that article? Like what happened in between in those years?
Yeah, so, at the age of 14, I decided to run away. From the age of 14, I decided to run away from our household, dealt with a lot of levels of abuse, which to your point, I've been interviewed about and written about. And so when I ran away, I was, honor roll scholarship student with all the, promise in the world. And I found myself seduced into the crack cocaine trade and experienced all the horrors of that culture. I was beat nearly to death. I was robbed at gunpoint. And when I was 17 years old, I was shot multiple times standing on the corner of my block. And 16 months later, unfortunately, I tragically shot and caused a man's death and was sentenced to 17 to 40 years in prison. I ended up serving 19 years of prison, and 7 of those years ended up being in solitary confinement. But it's in solitary confinement where I actually started writing and started taking it serious and wrote my first book in that environment.
Okay. So before we get to your first book that you wrote, there are a couple other things that I think are important to point out. Number one, you became a student of letters, right? You were devouring books of people who had written letters. And so what were some of those books that really made an impact on you?
Yeah, I mean, I've read so many books throughout the course of my incarceration. I remember the letters that were most resonant with me. Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter to Birmingham, from Birmingham jail. I remember just how striking it was for him to really talk to the clergy with such, high level articulation, but also with just the spiritual commitment that he had made. Nelson Mandela, who's, definitely a hero of mine, and, some of the letters he was writing home and the things that he talked about, and Lord Chesterfield letters, which was a whole different take on communicating to his son. So I was just devouring, different books, W.B. Du Bois and, many others. And as a form of writing, what always resonated with me with those books, one of the most powerful books, George Jackson's Soledad Brothers, where he writes all these letters to his dad and to Angela Davis, who many people know. But one of the things that was always struck me about those letters was the intimacy and the vulnerability, and that just level of transparency, which I think, when transmitted through letters, just is something, that's so sacred and divine, even when you think about what it takes to sit down and compose your thoughts in a most intimate way to share with one other individual. So those were some of the pieces that I was reading while I was inside.
And had your dad been writing you at that point from the very beginning, or did it take a while, or when did he start sending you letters?
Yeah, my dad. So those were the most important letters. Were the letters from my dad.
Right. Shout out to James C. White, by the way.
Absolutely, James C. White. My dad. He's a beautiful letter writer, and early on, from the beginning of my incarceration, we wrote, to each other, and what I think about the most is his honesty, and the vulnerability, and the way that he communicated. And we were able to talk about things that really can be complicated to talk about, especially as father and child. but also just as men. I was growing from a teenager into a man over those years, with very different experiences. And I think him writing letters may have come out of his military experience. But he wrote lengthy letters. It wasn't just like, "Hey, son, how you doing?" It was like very detailed, what was going on in the world. And he's definitely the source of inspiration for this book.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things that stood out to me, because I've written hundreds of letters in my life, and I've received hundreds of letters, and you don't meet a whole lot of people who are into letter writing like that. So I was really excited to read your letters. But one thing that really stood out was the length of your letters. And you're an author, I'm an author, so we kind of think in word count sometimes, and just my guesstimation was that your letters in the book, Letters to the Sons of Society, were probably about 1,000, maybe 2,000 words per letter. And I know when you write letters, it's mostly first draft. And so I was curious about that as I was reading. I was like, is this really first draft? I mean, were they really this long and this detailed? Because they're written perfectly. Or did you have to go back and add in details or fact check things, or edit them a little bit in order to publish them?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is, anytime you bring in a book to market, you have editors who are going to come in and be like, but I'm actually a very, like, when I'm in a zone, I like to write all the way through.
Mm-hmm.
And sometime before I actually, especially with this book, before I even sat down and wrote the letters, I would spend time thinking about what is most important for me to share with my sons. And so where it would start at would be just a stream of consciousness that I would actually write on my phone notes. And the reason that I learned this from August Wilson. So I was watching an interview with August some years ago, actually, while I was incarcerated. And he talked about how he would write out things on like napkins or things that were disposable. So it didn't feel like he was making a full commitment, and he didn't feel the pressure of it happening to be a thing. And so, what I took from that is, like, when you're struck by a thought, it's to just get it out. And so the way that I've approached, all of my writing it's really about getting those initial thoughts out. And a lot of times with me, they're very complete. They're very lengthy. It's very just me in a zone. I may be on a plane and I'm just, I spend that time just writing on my notes. And then I'll, transfer that to a document. And I'm like, oh, wow, like, this is a whole thing, and I think it's part of the dynamic with my editor and I is that we have a very great relationship, but it can be stressful at times because I write so much, and they're like, "Oh, we got to trim this down and blah blah," and I'm like, "But it's so good, like I can't take that line out, see that metaphor, that simile, or
you got to kill your babies, as they say.
You got to kill them off, So yeah, I'm pretty much like, especially with this book, these were moments of me just zoning out and thinking about what it was that I really needed to share with my sons.
Who's your editor, by the way?
So I got an editor named Derek Reed out of Penguin Random House. So
okay, cool.
Yeah.
So you mentioned MLK's Birmingham letters and Mandela's autobiography, and what I remember reading about that relates to your experience is when MLK was in the Birmingham jail, he wrote that letter on toilet paper. He wrote it on, because he didn't have anything to write with or write on. He had a nub of a pencil, and he wrote on that. And Mandela, he had to write his thing in secret, and they were like burying it so the guards wouldn't find it. And the one time they did find it and they got rid of it, and he had to rewrite it from memory and all of this kind of stuff. You mentioned that you had a flimsy little pen, because obviously if it's a real pen, you could use that as a weapon. So, and you started writing it on whatever you could in the dim light of, whatever you could see. So talk a little bit about that process when it actually started, and what are the rules? Like, can you write a book? Like, how do you do that? because you also talked about how you didn't have any money on the books and your friends kind of abandoned you a little bit. And you became, I guess, the stow man, as they call it in prison. The guy that sells stuff, that's
At a crazy markup. Yeah.
Yeah, with the crazy markup. Oh, what was the currency too, by the way, in your prison?
Yeah. So it changed over time. When I first went to prison, I was at Michigan Reformatory, and we used to get these little tokens, like imagine kind of like Chuck E. Cheese tokens, and they had denominations. I think we had $1 one, a $5, and a $10 one. And so that was, every 2 weeks you can, if you have money in your account from working or from your family, you can extract up to $75 in tokens out. And that was the currency. That's how people gambled. That's how they paid for, things that were kind of off market. So whenever the commissary store wasn't open, we would open our own stores and hustle in the cell block. And so basically what I would do is I would just load up, and then wait for people to run out of things. And there was very specific times when it's going to happen. It's like they're coming on that tail end of that 2 weeks, people are running out of cash. So they would get stuff for credit, and it was like 100% markup. So if you come get some cookies that cost 50 cents, if you come get some
tokens
that cost 50 cents in tokens, you owe me $1 token next, draw day. And then there was this one specific Saturday, they used to serve this fish that we call butt naked fish. It's unbreaded lump of, something that smells like a pond. And so nobody eats that. They're like, yo, give me some cookies, give me some chips. And so that was the market. But then over time, they took the tokens out to kind of disrupt the economy, the underground economy. They took the tokens out, and then stamps became the primary, means of making money. And one of the things about the stamps was that you can send stamps home, and your loved ones can take them to the local store and get cash in exchange. So I would load up on stamps and send, hundreds of dollars worth of stamps home. And then my family would send me the money back. And then they took the stamps out, and then it started becoming like bars of soap and ramen noodles and
mackerel.
Yeah, mackerel, whatever you can get. So that started becoming the currency in there.
Mm-hmm.
But to your point about the writing, so when I first started taking writing serious, I was in solitary. So I didn't have a typewriter or word processor. I literally just had this pen that they give you in solitary, and it's really flimsy. And so when I was struck with the idea to write, it actually started with me journaling first. And I was like, during my journal, I realized I had never completed anything. So I challenged myself to write a book. And when I wrote that book, first, before I even started, I was like, I'm never going to be able to finish a book with this pen. So I took that flimsy pen and I rolled it up in not newspaper, but paper, like the commissary paper that we would get. And that made an ink pen, and then I was able to write for hours on end.
And what were you writing on? Did you have like typing paper, or what was how were you writing? What were you writing your book on?
So I would get notepads. Even though I was in solitary, I still had a couple of hustles going. So some of my friends, they would smuggle cigarettes to me. And, and I would use those cigarettes to basically hustle. So, if a guy wanted a cigarette, I'd be like, get me, 3 notepads out of the store. And, that's how I would get notepads. Then they also have like this prison stationery that every month you're allotted about 20 sheets of paper. And so I would get those, like, the guys would get them and they're like, they're not doing anything. I'd be like, yo, run that, let me get that. And so, I still have to this day, all of my writings from prison. I'm so lucky and fortunate that I literally have everything that I've handwritten. I have my journals. I have the first drafts of my novels that I wrote. I have the versions of them that I typed up once I was able to get to a word processor. The ink is real light because I would run out of ink. And then I would just use carbon paper sometime. And sometimes I would just be like, as long as I can see the imprint on the paper, I know what's there. But I have all those things, and a lot of them are actually on prison-based, paper.
Okay, so your first book that you wrote, was that the one that eventually became Righting My Wrongs, or was this a different book? And then second question is, what genre of novels were you in there writing?
Yeah, so my first book, actually the first two books I wrote, I haven't even published those yet. I'm
Mm-hmm.
sitting on them very intentionally because I want to ensure that they're ushered into the world in the way that they really deserve to be, and that they get the kind of attention that they need from me. Especially as who I am as a writer today. There's some things I need to go back and do. But the first two books I wrote were novels. One is called Flagrant Foul. It's about this young lady who plays basketball, plays street ball, and she kind of gets caught up with something that happens in her community. And then there's one called Shadow Watchers, which is also almost like a futuristic, superhero movie. Book. I'm speaking a movie into existence now, but a novel based on these young people in the inner city who are trying to figure out how to solve problems in their community and address systemic, racism and oppression. And then the books that I first published, there's a series I have called Crack, and they're about this detective named Detective Jensen. I was inspired to write, detective stories about, Walter Mosley. But my greatest inspiration, honestly, as a writer, there's two inspirations that I draw from. One is Donald Goines, who, is the godfather of what's now, termed street literature.
Mm-hmm.
Those were the first books that I was really reading that I saw myself in. I saw the community that he was talking about. I saw the experiences that he was talking about because I had lived them. And so that inspired me to write fiction. And the greatest inspiration from a more literary standpoint is actually Rakim. I think that Rakim is a national treasure as a writer. When you think about his first couple of albums and how he played with words and how he played with metaphors and similes, like that inspired me. When I think about how I want my words to strike the page, I think about Rakim. I think about Nas. I think about people who have pinpoint accuracy lyrically, because I think that translates very well on a page.
So, for obviously, probably most people listening to this have never been inside of a prison. And can you just set the scene? Okay, so now we're in the period of your life where you're writing more or less prolifically in the solitary confinement. What is that? What is a day in the life like in terms of your writing and whatever else is going on in that 6 by 9 foot cell?
I'm happy you asked that. When I think about where I was at the time that I was writing, there's a few things that comes up. There's obviously the pain of the experience, and solitary confinement is something that I will forever advocate to have ended. I think it's the most barbaric and inhumane treatment that we can inflict on people consciously, and with our tax dollars. And I think to lock a person in a cell or a cage, for years at a time is cruel and unusual punishment. And the environment that I was in, the thing that struck me the most about it was the high level of mental health challenges that the men around me were faced with, and the way that showed up, whether it was men who were cutting themselves so that they can get taken to a hospital and receive some type of care and comfort from somebody who treated them with, humanity, or whether it was, just the personal attacks on each other, from, slinging feces on each other, to sleep deprivation by banging on the toilets in their cells. It was a very chaotic environment. Every day it was super noisy, and there was always the officers coming to extract people from their cells, and they come as 10 officers fully adorned in what looks like hockey apparel, and they would come and extract people and take them to whether the suicide watch cell or other cells, which meant they spray pepper spray, and that just goes through the whole unit. So there was days where you would just, I would be sitting on my bunk, and all of a sudden I'm coughing and whatever, because they're spraying pepper spray without consideration for everybody else around them. And it was chaos, and at one point, I started to question whether I was actually losing it because I wasn't reactive to so many of the things that other people was reactive to. And I was like, well, maybe I'm the one who's losing it, and they've got it all together. And that's the excuse me. And that's the psychological challenge of being in an environment where it's so chaotic and nothing is normal, and there's no idea of when you're going to get out. Kind of similar to what we're dealing with the pandemic, in the sense that uncertainty is always looming above you. And so, for me, writing in that environment required, a lot of ingenuity. I had to rate to what's the optimum time. And typically it was once the lights were out, in the cell block, then things would kind of quiet down. And so I would stand by the window. It's a little small window at the back of my cell, and a little bit of light that filtered in, I would write from that, and then sometimes I would lay on the floor and write from the little bit of light that leaked up under the cell door. So I was always just finding different ways to do it. And then I created just kind of a consistent cadence of like, what I want my experience to be like. This is once I started realizing that, we may not be able to control our circumstances, but I believe we can always control our reaction to them. And so I began to set my cell up as if I was at university. I would study, philosophy in the morning. I would go from philosophy to, world history, from world history to African history, from African history to, Eastern philosophy. And then I would get into literature, and then I would make time to just read. And then after I got done with that, then that's when I would write. So I just made sure that I consistently, kept my mind moving forward. I think people lose hope when they can't take that next step in their mind. And so those things allowed me to just every day to add some type of value to my life and to my experience, and really just to keep me moving forward.
What about more practical considerations such as exercise, food, water? Was that adequate when you were in there?
Well, the exercise part, that's up to you, and so I definitely, exercise every day. I would take my mattress and roll it up, and then I would tie a sheet around the mattress, and then I would loop another sheet through the mattress, and then I would curl the mattress. And so that's how I would do my curls. I would do like shoulder presses. And then I would just do push-ups and other calisthenics. And so that was part of that baked-in routine, just to keep my body moving forward. Meditation, that was so important to me, is like the ability to, process my mind in a way that emptied out all those negative self-defeating thoughts. Journaling, that was very practical. Practice for me is like to really get things out of my mind. In regards to food, we were solely reliant on whatever they were serving, so that was oftentimes not the best. The portions are very skimpy. You can't buy commissary out of the store when you're in solitary. And so the only edible thing you can buy are cough drops. And so cough drops became like candy as well as currency. But that was it, you can't save, you can't hoard food, because if they catch you with any food that you saved, basically they would put you on food restriction, and then you would get a big lump of what's called food loaf, which is all the food mashed up and baked into this brick. And so, to avoid that, you have to eat, whatever you can before you turn your tray in.
Mm. All right. So under all those conditions, you wrote your first book within 30 days. Did you know it was good, or how did you get any validation? You pass it around and let the other guys read it? How does it work?
Yeah, so I remember setting very intentional, parameters for finishing the book, because when I was journaling, I realized that I had never completed anything. I had, only thing I had completed was a GED, and so I was like, I want to challenge myself, and so I challenged myself to write this book in 30 days, and I got it done. And I remember thinking to myself, well, a book isn't a book until somebody reads it. And so I asked the guys on the cell block, I'm like, yo, anybody want to read this book, And a few guys was like, no, we don't read that, blah, blah. You ain't, this ain't Oprah's book.
Most of these guys can't even really read. They're operating on a third grade reading level, right?
Yeah, there's definitely a third grade reading level. But there's surprisingly, some guys who figure out, how to get through books that resonate with them. That's why I think Donald Goins was so important. And iceberg slim. I think you put more effort into something when you can see yourself in it. And, one guy, he was like, yeah, send it over to me. And I remember like I had to send it over on a fish line. So we would make these lines that we would attach stuff and slide it up under the door so that the other person can pull it in. And so, I remember sending it under the door and thinking to myself, this is my only copy, as the last part of it slid on the door. And if you don't give it back, there's nothing I could do because we're in solitary. But I remember him getting it, and I didn't hear from him for a couple of hours. So I started getting really nervous. I'm like, oh man, he gonna keep the book. Then that's gonna turn into a whole conflict when we get back to the yard. But
you gotta turn back into the old Shaka.
Got to go back to the thugging it out on the yard, and trying to avoid that at all costs. But I remember him coming back to the cell door, and he was like, "Yo, man, this is one of the best books I ever read."
Wow.
And I did like a little dance, like in my cell. I was like, "Yo, I did it, blah blah." And then I had this moment of clarity. I was like, "Well, he's in solitary confinement, so." Probably super bored.
His judgment is a little bit skewed.
I'm like, I could have sent him a recipe over there. He'd be like, man, this is the best chicken noodle soup ever. And so, I was like, I got to get my work out. And I eventually started sending work out to one of my brothers. He's my stepbrother, but we don't identify the step part. He's just my older brother. His name is, we call him Kid, but his name is Will Red. And I remember sending my older brother the book out. Initially I sent him some short stories first. And I remember him writing me, and he hadn't wrote me much, in prison. My older brother, he was like the one brother who had never had a brush with the system, never got caught up in the streets. He played ball for high school. He went to college. He was doing all the right things, and to this day, he's just an incredible example for me as a father, as a husband, and all the things that he does. Really, he inspires me. But I remember getting a letter from him, and he was like, man, he's like, I read all this stuff, when I was in college, and, I read all these different things people wrote. And he was like, you write better than most people I went to school with. And I was like, wow, like that validation meant something. It was like, this is something, I could take serious. And so I continued writing. And then I started, once I got out of solitary, I started sharing the books in the cell block, and just that grapevine of like guys coming like, yo, man, when can I get the book next? I heard so much about it. When guys started to talk about it, that you have no connection to, they don't know nothing about you. That's when I was like, okay, I'm on to something.
Okay, so as you're writing, were you recognizing any patterns? Like, if I tell more stories, if I'm like completely raw and honest, that's the stuff that connects with people the most? Or were you just kind of like just stream of consciousness and just writing whatever was coming to you?
I think a lot of it was, as I talked about early, being really influenced by hip hop. Mm-hmm. And, I think about, some of the artists that I've grown up loving. And the ones that always resonated with me was people who rap very cinematically. The great storytellers, the Cool G rap, the Nas's and people who are can bring you into their world. And that really, from a storytelling structure, the way that I've approached it is that I want people to feel like they're a part of this world, that they're having the experience of the characters, that they can smell the environment, they can taste the environment, they can be grossed out, they can fall in love, they can be angry, they can be, they can laugh, like, all the things. So I think that instinct really came from reading a lot and listening to a lot of hip hop. And what I started finding consistently in the reactions to my work is people would say, I felt like I was there. I felt like I was part of the experience. And so that became kind of, a thing where I was very intentional about, setting the scene and really setting up those connecting points and, the metaphors and the similes that really align with that more cinematic storytelling.
At what point were you aware that you were going to get out? And what was when you found out, and now you're writing these books and you're getting this response, what was your plan in your head, right? Before you actually walked out of those those gates? What were you thinking was going to happen with all of this?
Yeah, so I was excited. When I wrote the first couple of books, and and for years they were just like typed, in folders. I would carry them from, safeguard them with, with my everything. And during this time, there was this uptick in like literature that was coming from, communities, like real communities, like, Terry Woods, True to the Game, Sister Soldier, The Coldest Winter Ever, Quan, Animal, like all these great literary, like to me, they're literary giants, right? They may not rise to what people typically frame as literary, but I think if you can communicate a reality from an environment, that makes people feel something, that makes people feel connected, that makes people feel like they can see themselves in those stories, like that's greatness to me, and that's what they embody. And so I saw the way that they were hustling, they were hustling books. And, I also come from that era where, DJs would hustle, the tapes in the neighborhood. I used to DJ and we would sell a mixtape for $2, Too Short hustling, his album out of the trunk, and Masterpiece. So I knew those stories because I was reading, Vibe magazine and Source, and, keeping my ear to the street. So I knew that I can get out and sell books. I just had to get out. That was the big part of it, was getting out. And that was something I didn't know. I didn't know if I was ever getting out of prison, because that's what they told me, like, you would die in here. And so the first step was getting myself out of solitary, and then getting to
And you did that with a freaking letter.
Yeah. I wrote a letter to the warden, and it was a mixture of writing a letter and reading all these philosophical books. I challenged them on a philosophical idea of what the truth is. And basically what I did is I wrote the warden a letter, and I said, and I prefaced it with, what you're going to read is my truth. And if you follow the pattern of what my experience is, they line up with exactly what I said. When I came to prison, I said I wasn't following the rules. And I've been pretty consistent with that, which means that you can agree or disagree with me not following the rules, but what you have to agree with is that I told the truth. And if you believe that the truth is the most important thing, then everything that I'm about to tell you in this letter moving forward, I would hope that you acknowledge that as truth as well. And that's when I told them, if you give me an opportunity to get out, I'm going to pursue this writing thing. I'm going to take it serious. I'm going to stop doing the things I was doing on the yard to get in trouble. And I'm going to focus on becoming, the best writer that I can be. And it was the first and only time that a warden has ever directly wrote me back. And he said he was so moved by the letter, and he believed my truth, that he's going to advocate for me to get released from solitary. And he ended up doing that. And so it still took about 2 years because he had to go to his higher ups. But once I got out, I started typing those books up. I had a little a Brother's word processor. It was a Brother ML500. I had that little word processor. You can only see like half of a sentence on that little screen. And I would just type nonstop, for days on end, transferring those books to type, manuscripts. And so I did that. And that's what I shared in the cell blocks, those typed manuscripts, And meanwhile, I started putting a business plan together. I started kind of walking through what I wanted to happen with my writing. I was very intentional about where I wanted to land at and what I wanted it to become when I got out. I wrote in every genre you can think of. I started with, fiction. At one point, I wrote some erotica, which turned into a whole different things because, it was a mixture of me coming from being a hustler to evolving into like a real writer. And so it was like, okay, I can write and I know I can move products. So I'm gonna get out and I'm gonna hustle these books. And so, I ended up meeting Sekou's mom. Sekou is my youngest son, who I write about in the book. But I met his mom while I was incarcerated, and we started exchanging correspondence. And she was like, what is your plan for life? And I was like, I'm happy you asked. Here's what I want to do. And I sent her a whole business plan, a whole breakdown of how I was going to disrupt the literary scene, how I was going to approach it, the places I was going to go. My goal was to get out, get a job, save that money, buy some books, take those books, hustle them everywhere I could, buy more books, hustle them, rinse and repeat. And she was like, wow, like, she's like, I'm with it. Like, let me help you, you know? And so we ended up joining forces, and I actually published my first book from prison in 2008. I published Crack Volume 1. And as soon as I published the book, I got sued by the Department of Corrections for the cost of my incarceration. But I didn't let that deter me, you know, and you know, I went up for parole that same year, got denied, went back up the following year, got denied, and I decided I wasn't going back to the parole board at that point, and I was just going to do the time. And the reason I had, you know, thought about that was it was hard watching my dad, and at the time, you know, who was my girlfriend, it was hard watching them suffer. And I wanted to relieve them of getting their hopes up high, only to have them dashed by my denial of prison, you know, parole release. And so, you know, fortunately, Sekou's mom, you know, came to visit me the same day. And I sat in that visiting room and I was in tears. You know, it was heartbreaking watching her come through, you know, security and get patted down and have to take her shoes off and have to open her mouth and have to be touched and all the things. And I was like, I didn't want her to suffer through that anymore. And so when she walked in, you know, I was like, I got to break up with this woman, you know? And so, you know, as soon as she sat down, you know, I go into this whole spiel about, you know, we have to break up. And, you know, I broke down in tears and, you know, she just let me cry and get it out. And then she was like, you're absolutely going to your next parole board here. And like, you know, you can get it together and get back up in there, but we didn't come this far to give up, you know? And so, you know, I ended up going back and I got paroled on that third try, you know, and as they said, the third time was the charm. And so the first thing I did when I got out of prison, you know, they took me from the prison to the parole office. I had to check in with my parole office. And, you know, Ebony, who was Sekou's mom, she pulls up, her and my oldest son, Jay. And, you know, there was a brother who was getting out. His name is Prince Montgomery. He was getting out the same day we had met on like the last 60 days of my sentence. And he's like, man, I'm gonna buy one of your books when I get out. And I thought he was talking about once he got home and kind of like got himself together. But, you know, he had money in his account and they, you know, they gave him that. And, you know, he was like, yo, did your girl bring them books? And she was like, yeah, I got them in the trunk, you know. I'm like, yo, pop that trunk, you know. And I remember him giving me, the books were only $15. He gave me $20. I didn't have no change because I didn't have no money on me. And he was like, man, keep that extra $5, man. I'm happy to support you, you know. So every year we celebrate our freedom anniversary, but we also celebrate the moment of my first actual hand-to-hand book sale, you know. And I've been selling books ever since. So, yeah.
Yeah, you talked about selling books to put gas in your Honda Accord, and you were going around mentoring kids and all of that.
Yeah.
I imagine you never dreamed in a million years that you'd be interviewed by Oprah and all of this, you know, from one of your books at that time. But talk about what those next breadcrumbs were along that path. Like, I know there was a college or something that was interested in one of your books.
Yeah, so actually I did think that I would be interviewed by Oprah.
Okay.
But I'm gonna tell you why. You know, I believe, you know, I believe in the laws of attraction. I believe that we can manifest into our lives the things that we desire. And I was super intentional about what I wanted to happen with my work. So I wrote it down. I was like, you know, if I'm going to be a real writer, Oprah has to read one of my books. And for me at that time, that's the validation that I needed to confirm this was a life for me as a writer. I was like, I want to be a New York Times bestseller. I wrote that down. You know, so I was very intentional about writing down exactly what I wanted to happen. And, you know, of course, it didn't happen in the way that I imagined. I imagined I'm just going to send her the first, you know, we're going to send her Crack Volume 1. You know, Oprah's going to read that and be like, yo, it's really going down in the hood. You know, I need to be in tune with that. But it didn't work out like that. But what did happen is there was a professor who was at SUNY, State University of New York, Binghamton. And she had been introduced to me by a young lady who used to edit their paper, who I had became pen pals with while I was in solitary. And she got my first book and she assigned that book to her class.
Hmm.
And then they ended up inviting me to come speak. So my first professional speaking gig was at, she had moved from that college to a college in Wisconsin, Platteville. And that was my first gig. So that was kind of like the beginning of like, this is, really starting to happen. Like my book is, in a college, officially part of college curriculum. And so that was the first kind of thing of like, hey, this thing can happen, And so I started doing these talks, but I was also doing work in the community, and I was using literature as a means to mentor kids at the school called Cody High School, and on the west side of Detroit, and then there was another one in a suburb called Tri-County, in a suburb of Detroit called Southfield. And I was using literature, and I ended up winning this award called Black Male Engagement Leadership Award. And that allowed me to write another book called Live in Peace. And it was kind of like a workbook that I used in my mentoring program. And that experience really opened up the world to me, So after I won that award, the organization, they would invite me to these gatherings. And I ended up going to one of those gatherings, and that's where I met the director of MIT Media Lab, Joy Ito. And Joy, invited me to learn about the Media Lab. So I went from, nearly 2 decades in prison to being in Cambridge, Massachusetts at MIT Media Lab with all these crazy robotics and 3D printing. And I mean, like, it was like, and I talked about it in my TED Talk, when I tell people, it was like Fred Flintstone walking into an episode of the Jetsons. Like, that is no exaggeration. Like, I didn't know anything about technology. The internet hadn't been created before I went to prison. There was no smartphones. There were no iPads. None of the things that we, now have at our disposal. So when I walked to the Media Lab, I was just like, I mean, there was one thing that stuck out to me out the gate. There was a car that basically folded up the wheels and parallel park. And I was like, yo, this is crazy, right? But it sparked my imagination, and from there, I just was like, anything is possible, And so I went on to do, TED and, be interviewed by Oprah, which was one of the most groundbreaking experiences of my life. Because that was like 5 years after I'm out, But the thing is, no, go ahead.
I was gonna say the other thing that I want people to understand is that when someone gets out of, I've had family members in prison. When you get out of prison, it's hard to get an apartment.
Absolutely.
It's hard to get a car. It's hard to get a job. It's hard to get a bank account, right? Because you have to report that you're a felon in each of those cases. And so one of the biggest priorities is rebuilding and getting back on your feet financially, et cetera, especially as a man, and especially as a man in his 40s. No one's feeling sorry for you if you can't pay your bills. So a lot of your family, a lot of your friends are telling you, hey, Shaka, don't tell anybody you've been, just keep your head down, go get you a decent job. And you kind of defied all of that because you believed in yourself so much. So I just wanted to make a note of that, because I think it adds it adds context to the courage you had to have to really lean into your story and to use that.
Yeah, absolutely. I tell all my mentees that what you believe about yourself is more important than what anybody else believes about you. And when I came home, I know my family had like the best of intentions. They really wanted me to just find a job and live the rest of my life. I come from a working class community. People who work for the factories and work in social work and things of that nature. So they just like, if you can get a job, you'll be fine. And I put in for jobs. It wasn't like I didn't come out like I can just pull magic out of the air in some random way. I knew I had to have a game plan, but it was hard to get hired, and I would get these little random jobs. My first job actually was writing for a local newspaper. And every job that I've had since I've been out of prison have come through these very unconventional ways. I ended up posting, like I opened up a Facebook page because I knew the marketing side. I'm like, I got to get to reach the people, right? I don't know nothing about this social media. I just know it's people on there and they need to be buying my book. And I remember making a post and just saying, if there's any local artists, send me your music so I can write a music review. And I had two missions in mind. One was to get access to free music, and the other one was just to keep my writing skills sharp. And there was a woman following me at the time who was the managing editor at a local newspaper called the Michigan Citizen. And her name was Zenobia. And Zenobia was like, hey, can you do reviews for us? And I was like, sure. So I write these two reviews. And then she called me and was like, hey, come pick up your check. And I was like, what check? What are you talking about? And she's like, oh, we're paying you for those reviews. And it was like $25 or something. But I was like, wow, I made some money writing these reviews. And so I just started writing. It was like a couple extra dollars coming in, $50 extra a week. I wasn't making a ton of money. I didn't have a job. And so every penny counted, And then one day she hits me up and she was like, one of our staff writers isn't available. Can you cover this story? And I went and wrote this story. It was about this man. His name is Lauren Harper, Detroit-based theater actor. And he had his movie coming out about, it's about this church, et cetera. And I remember going to interview him. And, the story of the movie that was coming out was fine. It was cool. But his story was fascinating. He had been addicted to crack cocaine for, a long time in his life. And he found theater therapeutic, and he found that art form as a means to help with his healing. And he was also running a drug rehab program and using art to help people find their way. And so I ended up writing his story. Weeks later, after the paper comes out, the managing editor, she calls me in and she gives me this stack of mail. And she's like, we've never got this much mail for an article in this newspaper. And so they just started offering me the opportunities to cover different stories. And then they allowed me to go out and find stories. So a lot of my friends to this day, I found them through writing their stories because they were small business owners. Actually, one of my best friends' name is Clement Brown Jr. He's a fashion designer, owns a store called 313. I write about him in the book. I met him writing about his business at the time. And now we've been friends for 11 years. So that's the kind of the pathway forward. Then the mentoring program, I ended up, winning that award. It came with like a $25,000 stipend. I was able to pay myself for the month, get some supplies, do the programs. And then that following year, that organization hired me as a consultant. And so it was like all these little, consulting one-offs, just enough to pay the bills, just enough to get from point A to point B while I continue writing. But it was during that time, as I was doing all these things, when people would, they were reading, hearing about, Crack Volume 1, but they would always say to me, like, you don't sound like someone who's been in prison. And they meant it as a compliment. Yeah. But it always drudged up something really hurtful to me, because when I was in prison, I met some of the most brilliant men in my life. And that still holds true today. And I know some incredible people. My network is full of some of the most brilliant scientists and venture capitalists and entrepreneurs and actors and writers. I met some of the most brilliant men in prison. These men are my mentors. They are the men who guided me to books. They are the men that saw something in me before I saw anything in myself. And so that bothered me, and I was like, I need to tell people about how I went to prison, because my story isn't unique. Inside our prisons in America, there is a wealth of talent, a wealth of genius. There's a wealth of creativity, entrepreneurship, and good people who unfortunately have either made decisions that landed them there because of a series of things that happened in their life, or people who were falsely accused. And so that's what inspired me to write Righting My Wrongs. And, I wrote that book, self-published that originally in 2013, and hustled it like I hustled the rest of the books. But there was something different happening with the response to that book. I started to see this uptick in this groundswell of people like, this is an important book, and this book needs to be out in the world. And so, we hustled the book. I remember sending, one person who supported me, they bought books for every prison in America. They were so moved by the book. They was like, if you put together a list of all the prisons in America, I'll write you a check to send books to them. And I remember, putting together a little crew of my friends and my brother. And, we sat in my garage and we packed, over 1,000 books and sent them to prisons. And Sekou's mom, we sent them to prisons literally all over America, and so eventually I was doing a talk. And after I did the talk, there was a woman there. And this woman, her husband came up to me later on, like after the talk, sure you've done these talks where they have like the kind of happy hour room and everybody's just kind of chilling afterward.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sitting there and this brother comes up to me, super clean cut brother, very polished. And he's like, I'm really upset with you, And I'm like, oh man, what did I say in my talk that offended him? I'm thinking he's about to be like, I'm tired of hearing these, come from the hood stories, blah, blah, blah. I'm thinking he's about to lay into me, And I'm like, what's going on? How did I offend you? He's like, my wife is in the room reading your book. We supposed to be out here having fun, getting some time away from the kids, and she don't want to leave the room, And so we had a laugh and, finished the night with drinks and all that. It turns out that his wife, who's now a dear friend of mine named Andrea, she used to work for Oprah. And so she took the book to Oprah.
The self-published book.
The self-published book. Yeah, the self-published one. Oprah gets the book and she's like, why would I read this book? This guy's on the cover, with tattoos and barbed wire fences, and he's been in prison for murder. Like, why would I read this book, And what Oprah said is that she took that book and kept moving it around her house because she doesn't throw books away. Mm-hmm. And finally, when she was moving her operation to LA, she said, she was like, let me just take this book. So she took the book with her. She's on her plane. Says she got 50 pages in. It was like, I got to interview this guy. And Oprah has gone on to say that our interview was one of the best in her, not just in her career, but in her life. And that, Right My Wrongs is one of her favorite books of all time, one of her favorite memoirs. She said it was her favorite memoir until Will Smith dropped his memoir. So I might have got bumped down. I don't know yet. But
what was that day like when you got that call? Was it Andrea that called you or Oprah's other people that called you?
So Andrea called me first and was like, Oprah wants to interview you. She wants you to come out to Hawaii. And I was just like, well, what actually happened was, so Andrea calls me. She comes to an unknown number at the time. I answer it because I answer all unknown numbers at the time. I'm like, I got, it might be some business. It might be some bills I owe. I don't know which one, but let me gamble. Answer the call. She's like, hey, Shaka, I want to talk to you, blah, blah. And then the phone disconnects. And she calls me the next day and she's like, I'm so sorry. Something's going on with the kids, blah, blah, blah. She was like, but I was calling you because Oprah wants to interview you and I want to connect you to her producer. And I was like, wow, she wants you to come to Hawaii. So she connects me to the producer. Producer is like, yeah, she wants you to come, this, that, and other. So I set it up. So I'm hyped. I'm like, yo, I'm going to Hawaii. I ain't never been. Only thing I've ever seen is like Hawaii 5-0 when I was a kid. And so I'm hyped up. I got this idea of how I'm going to be greeted getting off the plane. And, the producer calls back and like, Oprah doesn't want you to come to Hawaii. So my heart literally just sank. I'm like, in my mind, I'm like, what did she read in the book that she changed her mind? And he was like, she actually wants you to come to her home in California. And I was just like, I remember on a plane ride there, reflecting back on what I wrote in my journal about being interviewed by her and really, that moment for me solidified everything else I had wrote that I desired to manifest in my life. And I knew with absolute certainty that all the things I wanted to happen would come to fruition because that moment happened, and, it was a surreal experience, and from there we end up becoming friends and, it's still surreal to this day, whenever I get a message from her or, anything of that nature, I'm just like, wow, like, yo, Oprah just texted me, but it's the power of manifestation, and I remember her saying to me, you are a master manifester. And that stuck with me and has stuck with me to this day.
Well, I also, hearing this story and reading about it in your book, I think it's important for people to understand that manifestation goes hand in hand with follow through, with putting in the work, with staying focused, with almost being obsessive about your mission. And one of the things I've written recently is how when you take a leap of faith in the direction of service, it's addictive. It's addictive. When those two guys, who you thought were about to ambush you, actually wanted a hug from something you wrote, I'm sure deep down that was inspiration for you to keep writing in that same transparent way. And a lot of people would think, oh, in order to get on Oprah, I have to be represented by Random House, or you got on Oprah from a self-public, that you got the deal because you were on Oprah, And so I think the message that I got from this is it doesn't matter what it looks like from the outside in. What matters is, are you operating in alignment with what you're feeling inside? And as long as you keep doing that, you'll receive the internal validation to keep doing it more and more, because we all want to help. We all want to use whatever we can to help people. And as soon as you see the light turn on in one person's eyes, that guy who bought the book from you coming out of prison, I mean, that's such strong validation that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. And so that's such a powerful story. And by the way, people listening to this, all of these little vignettes that we're talking about are in your most recent book, Letters to the Sons of Society. And so there's another vignette that I wanted to touch on in our last few minutes together, which I think is also important, right? So you've been interviewed by Oprah. You've been interviewed by Trevor Noah. You have money coming in. You're giving speeches, probably for tens of thousands of dollars and all of that. And you wrote to your sons that while all of this, quote, success was happening, you felt miserable.
Absolutely. Yeah, so what I tell people, and I'm happy you articulated the effort that goes into manifesting the things that you desire in your life. Oftentimes people look at people who, in their opinion, have made it, right? And I think that's super subjective because everybody's bar is different, but the work that goes into it, the commitment, the dedication to learn, to really understand, what I needed to do to be successful as a writer, and to really get my words out into the world, that's no sleep. That's, relentless pursuit of perfection and the craft and really understanding the language. But there was also a whole nother thing happening. I was returning to a world that was foreign to me. And, I always explain it to people like this, is that when I got out of prison, it's like I was on 7 different lanes of traffic all at one time. I was reconnecting with my family. I was trying to be a father. I was in a relationship. I was trying to find employment. I had to understand this new world of technology, which people had grown up with for years. And I got to learn all this immediately. I realized I had PTSD that hadn't been resolved from prior to me going to prison. I'd been shot and had never seen a therapist. The fear of going back to prison. So there were so many things going on. And my reaction to that and my response was to hustle harder, to keep going, but also to party harder and to hang out and to, drink in excess and just, random women and all the things that, were numbing the real problems that were existing internally. And so there was a commitment that I had to make to resolve those things. But what I wanted to set up for my sons was the truth that, when you see a person who is in a more public space, don't assume that everything for them is easy or that they somehow have a charmed life that doesn't come without adversity, obstacles, uncertainty, insecurity, self-doubt, all the things that, can send you down a different direction. But what I've learned about this law of attraction came from me actually journaling. And it started with me asking myself this essential question: how did I land here? And that came from me reading philosophy. I was reading Socrates' Apology, and he talked about the unexamined life not being lived. And so I began to examine my life and ask that question, how did I get here? Like, what happened that landed me here when I had a dream of being a doctor? You know, I'm supposed to be helping save lives, and here it is, I'm in prison for taking a life. And so that made me realize that I had magnetized into my life my current reality. When I was in prison, you know, I had certain thoughts that led me down that path. After I got shot, I was like, I'm shooting first. That was a narrative that began to play, that was a narrative that began to play both consciously and subconsciously. And that manifested in me shooting and taking a man's life and ended up in prison. And what I believe that is if it worked in the absolute negative, then it can work in an absolute positive if the underlying truth of you attract into your life what you think about and then take action on the most. And so when I began to take these action steps, I started seeing different results. And it doesn't mean that it didn't come without the complications. It didn't come without the setbacks, without the turnbacks, without the no's. I received a ton of no's. Like, I can't even tell you how many, you know. I remember before getting the book deal, a agent had me fly out to Boston after he read the book, had me so excited. I'm hyped up. I'm like, oh, I'm about to get this book deal. My book is going to be everywhere, which was the thing for the book deal, right? Was distribution. It wasn't about, you know, making money, because I was making money hustling the books. It was like distribution, making that easier, et cetera, right? And he says to me, I can make this a bestseller if you turn it to fiction.
Hmm.
And I was like, so you want me to make up my life as if my life did not exist, as if these traumas aren't real, as if the things that happened weren't real, and that they can only be imagined through a character? Sir, I kindly decline your offer. You know, because I'm willing to bet on myself, and I know that if I go hard, if I do what I said I came to do, that I will produce those outcomes that I, you know, destined to produce. And that's the essential messaging, you know, especially for, you know, my sons. And when I say my sons, like, yes, this book and these letters are written to my biological sons, but I'm a mentor to many. You know, I have nephews and, you know, nieces, and even, you know, though this is my sons, the lessons in this book aren't gender specific. They're life specific. And I think that's really important for people to understand, that the takeaways in this book are rooted in not something that I imagine, not some type of theory or philosophy I have. These are real lived experiences that produce real lived outcomes.
What has the response been from your sons? Did they give you real-time feedback that kind of inspired you to write the next letter and the next letter, or was it more of a therapeutic sort of experiment for you?
I think it was more therapeutic for me to really think about, you know, I think of these as my legacy letters, you know, when all is said and done. And, you know, I wrote this in the height of COVID and social unrest where, you know, we weren't even certain about what the world would even look like, you know, the next day. And I just knew, like, I had an opportunity to memorialize these moments for my younger son, but also speak to some things that hadn't been addressed for my older son. Currently, my older son doesn't have any interest in reading the book. And, you know, as people read it, they'll understand why, you know, what that experience is with he and I. But just recently, you know, I let my younger son read some of the chapters. Some of them are a little, you know, a little bit more mature than he's ready for. So there's
Right.
some
He's like
chapters.
10, right? 9 or 10 at this point.
Yeah, he's 10, but he's very precocious, but he's still my 10-year-old baby, you know? And so there are some chapters I'm like, okay, you got to get like maybe 2 more years, you know, maybe 3 before he goes. But I remember letting him read the opening, you know, the intro. And his reaction was hands down, like, I don't care what else happens with this book. I don't think there will be another reaction to this book that's better than his reaction to the intro to the book. And like, that was just like, it was the best experience ever, man, to see him hop up out of his chair. Like, what? Your dad bought you the Pro Wings, and he don't, you know, he has a little bit of context, but, you know, to write it in a way that somebody who doesn't even have that experience can have that kind of reaction. I was like, okay, this is going to be good. So the most exciting thing is seeing how it resonates with people.
And you had that one letter at the end. I don't even want to go into it because I want people to read it for themselves. But about Jay, your older son.
Yeah.
scared. I was like, oh my God, what's what happened? And because
Yeah.
I didn't hear about this, but yeah,
Yeah.
it's an interesting twist
Yeah. Yeah.
at the end of that letter.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I mean, that moment, when it happened, and it speaks back to what I'm talking about in the book is, we have a lot of people theorizing and philosophizing about Black boys and Black men and what our experiences are with gun violence, with prison, with policing in our communities. A lot of those people don't have the lived experience. And I only wanted to write from the experience that I've actually lived and speak to things, based on what I believed on, as it relates to those experiences. And that is the opening letter of the book. And what happens there, it still haunts me to this day. Like, anytime I even talk about what that experience was like for me and my family, and especially me as a dad, having to communicate that to my dad, it is just the mostly charged part of the book, that, was a real experience and I learned a lot from. And I think a lot of the lessons of life, that I believe are in that chapter.
what's something about you today as a public figure that you feel like most people don't get about you?
I think that most people don't get that I'm not as serious as they believe me to be. I like to joke, man. I have a great sense of humor. Um,
Mhm.
I'm happiest, man, when I'm just around people and we just talking smack and we just listening to music. I am the biggest hip hop fan. When I tell you, like, people see some of the things, like I was just on a song with Nas on his latest album, and people were like, "Oh my God, blah blah." Like, I'm like, y'all don't even know, y'all don't even understand what this like means to me to, like, be on a song alongside somebody who I revere, because of my reverence for hip hop as a culture. And I'm not one of them old heads that's like, I only listen to old stuff and these new cats, man. I'm listening to everything. I'm listening to Nas one minute, it's 21 Savage the next minute. I'm, listening to Rakim, and then it's Roddy Ricch, and I'm listening to all my Detroit artists, Big Sean, and T Grizzly, Sada Baby, and then I'm going back to the oldies, PE and Ice Cube and things like that. But music really, it moves me. It's my soul. It's something I love. I'm super passionate about. And so those are things that people wouldn't know, that music and humor are what really get me through life.
Beautiful, man. Well, I just wanted to loop back around to childhood for a moment here, and just thinking back about the milk crates, milk crate conversation,
Yeah.
and the versatility of that, and the multi-use nature of that, and thinking about the trajectory of your life, how you kind of, it's very much, to me, it's a reflection of how you've been used for multiple purposes, right? And I think you're just getting started. Actually, I think that this journey for you is still in the early days. I think you still have a lot of life to live. You have a lot to teach. You have a lot to leave behind in your mentoring role, in your writing role, and so I just want to acknowledge you for being so focused. And you wouldn't wish isolation or solitary confinement or prison on anyone, but I'm sure another question that may come up for maybe you or for other people is, would you have been as prolific as a writer had you not been in that kind of situation? And so I don't think that's a question with an answer, but because we can never know. But I'm grateful for everything that you've experienced, because if you hadn't been through those experiences, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. Perhaps, who knows? So anyway, thank you for making the best of everything you've experienced, and then for sharing your story so openly, so transparently, and so honestly, because I think that is the secret to good writing. It's not about grammar. It's not about sentence structure. It's about honesty. If you can write honestly, you will connect with people. People will be touched by your words.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me, man.